Hi, and welcome back to Buddy Chronicle. Today, I want to tell you about the afternoon I stopped at my son's house to drop off a spare key, and how that 10-minute errand turned into the worst night of my life and the most important thing I have ever done. The sound was coming from inside the wooden chest in the basement. I was 64 years old, retired, standing in a house that belonged to my son and his wife, holding a key I had already set on the kitchen counter. I should have left. I had already done what I came to do. But I heard something, a muffled thumping, rhythmic, desperate, coming up through the floor from somewhere below me. I stood still and listened. It stopped, started again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Someone was down there. My son Derek had called me that morning, sheepish, embarrassed, the way he always got when he needed a favor. "Dad, Sandra lost her house key again. Any chance you could swing by and leave your spare on the counter? I've got a meeting until 4. He was 38, a project manager at a logistics firm, always in meetings. His wife Sandra worked part-time at a dental office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This was a Wednesday. I had assumed the house was empty. I found the door to the basement at the end of the hallway, next to the laundry room. It was unlocked. I went down the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, the light from the small window above the utility sink barely reaching the far corner. The basement smelled like old carpet and dryer sheets and something else underneath both of those things, something I couldn't name yet. The wooden chest was against the far wall, half hidden behind Derek's old road bike and a stack of plastic storage bins. It was large, the kind of piece you see at estate sales, dark, stained oak with iron hardware, probably 3 feet deep and 5 feet long. It had a hasp on the front with a small padlock, the cheap kind you find at any hardware store. The thumping was coming from inside it. My granddaughter was 8 years old. I knew her size, her weight, the exact pitch of her voice when she was frightened. I crossed the basement in 4 steps, and I said her name once through the wood. "Grandpa. Grandpa, help me. Please." I did not have a crowbar. I did not have anything. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the tool bucket next to the water heater, and I worked the hasp until the screws pulled free of the wood. It took maybe 90 seconds. It felt like an hour. When I opened the lid, my granddaughter was curled on her side with her knees pulled to her chest, her hands pressed flat against the wood above her face. The chest was lined with an old quilt, dark floral print, and the air inside was stale and warm and wrong. She blinked at the light. Her eyes were wet and her face was red, and she had been crying long enough that her cheeks had gone tight and puffy. "Grandpa, come here, sweetheart." I lifted her out. She weighed 61 pounds. I know because I had held her at the doctor's office just 6 weeks before when she got a booster shot and cried, and I held her after, and the nurse said 61 pounds, right on track. I carried her to the stairs and sat down on the 3rd step with her in my lap, and I held her the way I had held her when she was a baby, her head against my chest, my arms around her back. How long were you in there?" She shook her head. She didn't know. She had fallen asleep, she said. She'd been in the dark long enough to fall asleep. "How did you get in there, sweetheart? Who put you in there?" Her answer was quiet, and she said it the way children say things that have become ordinary to them, with no particular weight, just a statement of fact. "Grandma Helen. She does it when I'm bad." I felt something move through me then, slow and cold, not anger yet, something before anger, a kind of recalibration. The world rearranging itself around a fact it was not supposed to contain. I asked how many times. She held up 4 fingers. Then she looked past me at the far corner of the basement. Her expression changed. She pressed her face back against my chest. "Grandpa, don't look in that other box." I turned around. I had not noticed it when I crossed the basement. It was smaller than the chest, set back behind the furnace, partially covered with a moving blanket. Square, maybe 2 feet on each side, dark wood, older than the one my granddaughter had been in. It had a hasp as well, but the padlock on this one was different, Heavy, steel, the kind that doesn't bend. What's in there, sweetheart? She didn't answer for a moment. When she did, her voice was barely there. Grandma says that's where she keeps the things that don't listen anymore. I called 911 from the kitchen with my granddaughter on the couch beside me, her fingers wrapped around two of mine. I told the dispatcher my name. I told her the address. I told her I had found my 8-year-old granddaughter locked in a wooden chest in the basement, and that there was a second locked box down there that I believed needed to be examined. The dispatcher told me not to go back downstairs. She told me police were on the way. She told me to keep my granddaughter warm and calm. I did both of those things. I also kept looking at the basement door. My son arrived at 4:22, 17 minutes after I called. He came through the front door already talking, already explaining, already mid-sentence about the meeting running long and traffic on Route 9, and then he saw his daughter wrapped in a kitchen blanket on the couch, and he stopped mid-word. He looked at me. He looked at her. He looked at the two officers standing in the doorway to the hallway. "Dad, what happened?" I told him. I watched his face go through things I could not name. When I got to the part about Grandma Helen, his jaw locked. When I got to the part about the second box, something else happened to his face. Something older than shock. "Where's Sandra?" I asked. "She went to her mother's after work. She does that sometimes on Wednesdays." He pulled out his phone. She didn't answer. The detective, who arrived at 5:15, was a woman in her mid-40s. Dark hair pulled back, the kind of calm that comes from having seen enough that almost nothing surprises her anymore. Her name was Detective Carol Harmon. She sat across from me at the kitchen table while a second officer stayed with my granddaughter in the living room, letting her watch something on a tablet. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "tell me about Helen Marsh." Helen Marsh was Sandra's mother. She was 66 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Garfield County, Indiana, who had moved to Ohio 8 years ago when Sandra and Derek got married. She lived 12 minutes away in a small ranch house on a cul-de-sac. She drove a cream-colored Buick. She brought casseroles when people were sick, and she shook your hand firmly at church, and she had never, not once in 8 years, done anything that made me look twice. Or so I had believed. "Sandra is her only child?" Detective Harmon asked. I hesitated. "No. She had a son, Sandra's younger brother. He left when Sandra was still young. There was a story about it. Something vague. I had never asked for details." Detective Harmon wrote something down. "Do you know the son's name?" "Marcus." I thought it was Marcus. Sandra mentioned him once, years ago on Christmas, a little wine in, and she had gone quiet after, and Derek had changed the subject, and I had taken my cue like I always did in other people's families and let it go. The detective nodded slowly. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "did your granddaughter give you any indication of what might be in the second container?" "She said it was where Helen keeps the things that don't listen anymore." Detective Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and thanked me and went to find the officer who had gone back down to the basement with an evidence kit. I did not see inside that second box. I want to be clear about that. I was in the kitchen with my son when they opened it, and I will tell you what I was told afterward, not what I saw. But I heard one of the officers come up the stairs and speak to Detective Harmon in a low voice in the hallway, and I heard the word remains, and I heard the word child, and then I heard nothing else because Derek had already grabbed his daughter off the couch and held her against him and was crying, in a way I had never once heard my son cry before. I went outside and sat on the front step. I was 64 years old, and I had spent 40 years as an electrician, and I had buried my wife 9 years before, and I had thought, in that long, quiet way you sometimes think after enough hard things, that I had already felt the worst of what the world had to offer. I had been wrong. Sandra arrived at 6:40. I watched her pull into the driveway and get out of her car and look at the police cruisers and the unmarked detective vehicle and the evidence van, and something crossed her face before she arranged it. Just a flicker, here and then gone. She went to Derek first. She went to my granddaughter. She held her and cried. Then Detective Harmon stepped forward and asked if Sandra would come inside to answer some questions, and Sandra said, of course, whatever you need." I watched her walk through the front door. I did not go back inside for a long time. The remains in the second box were human. A child, male, estimated age between 7 and 10 years old at time of death based on skeletal development. The box had been sealed with an airtight gasket, the kind used for canning jars, and the interior had been treated with a desiccant compound that had slowed decomposition significantly. Whoever had placed the child in that box had known what they were doing, had thought about it, had prepared. Detective Harmon came to my son's house the following morning to speak with us. Derek and I sat at the kitchen table. My granddaughter was at a neighbor's house. Sandra was not there. Sandra had been at the police station since the previous evening. The remains, Detective Harmon told us, were consistent with a child who had been deceased for somewhere between 20 and 30 years. Sandra's brother, Marcus Marsh, had been reported missing in September of 1998. He was 8 years old. Helen Marsh had reported him to police as a runaway, claiming he had packed a bag and left while she was at work. The case had been investigated, briefly, and closed when no evidence of foul play was found. Helen had accepted condolences from her community. She had put up a small cross in the church garden with his name on it. Marcus had never been found. Dental records confirmed the identification 4 days later. Marcus Marsh had not run away. He had been dead within 48 hours of his disappearance. Cause of death, asphyxiation. He had been placed in an airtight container while still alive. The medical examiner's report was careful and clinical, and I will not describe the details of it here because I read them once, and once was enough. Helen Marsh had kept her son's remains for 27 years. When she moved from Garfield County to Ohio in 2016, she had the box transported with her furniture. Sandra had been told it contained her grandmother's china. She had stored it in the basement without ever opening it. That was what Sandra said. Detective Harmon did not tell us whether she believed her. I will tell you something about my daughter-in-law that I have thought about many times since. Sandra was not a cold woman. She was not cruel. She was a good mother most of the time, patient and funny and present, the kind of mother who showed up to school plays and remembered her daughter's friends' names. She loved my son. I believe that fully. She was also a woman who had grown up in Helen Marsh's house. She was a woman who, when I asked her once at a family dinner why she never talked about her childhood, had smiled thinly and said, "There's not much to talk about. I learned to be good early." Learn to be good. Detective Harmon interviewed Sandra for 6 hours on the first night and 4 hours the following day. I was not present. What I know comes from Derek, who was told some of what Sandra disclosed, and from the court documents that became public record later. Sandra had known, as a child, that Marcus was gone. She had been 9 when it happened, 1 year older than he was. She had not been told directly. What she had been told was that Marcus had been bad, that bad children sometimes had to go away, and that if Sandra was not good, she might have to go away too. She had been placed in a closet twice for what Helen called thinking time. Once for 6 hours when Sandra was 11, once for a full night when she was 13. She had spent the next 30 years being very, very good. She had not asked about the box. She had not asked about many things. When you grow up learning that certain doors stay closed, you stop seeing them. I'm not telling you this to defend her. I am telling you because I have spent a long time trying to understand how a woman who loved her daughter could leave that daughter alone with Helen Marsh. How she could have missed it, or chosen not to see it. And the only answer I have come to is that some people are trained from childhood to look away, and unlearning that is the hardest thing in the world. It does not excuse what happened to my granddaughter. Nothing will ever excuse that. Helen Marsh was arrested on the evening of the day the dental records came back. She was at her house on the cul-de-sac. She was sitting in her living room watching the evening news when the officers knocked. She came to the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, and according to the officer who was there, she showed no particular emotion when she was informed that she was being placed under arrest for the murder of Marcus Marsh. She asked if she could turn off the television first. They let her. She was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Marcus Marsh, attempted murder and false imprisonment in the case of my granddaughter, and child endangerment. She retained a private defense attorney. She did not speak publicly. She did not explain. She did not confess. At the competency hearing, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated her said something that has stayed with me. She testified that Helen Marsh exhibited a profound dissociation between her emotional responses and the welfare of the children in her care. In her internal framework, children were extensions of her authority, not separate people with rights or inner lives. When they failed to meet her standards, she did not experience guilt or grief. She experienced a problem to be managed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty. All counts. The judge was 60 years old, a woman who had served on the bench for over 20 years, and when she sentenced Helen Marsh to life in prison without the possibility of parole, she did not read from prepared remarks. She looked at Helen directly and she said what she had to say in plain language that did not require legal training to understand. I read the transcript 3 times. Sandra was not charged. The investigation found no evidence that she had knowledge of Marcus's fate or of the systematic abuse of our granddaughter. The family court, however, was not the criminal court, and the standard is different. She had left her daughter in Helen's care over 40 separate times in the past 2 years. My granddaughter had exhibited signs of anxiety around her grandmother that Sandra had attributed to shyness. She had had recurring nightmares. She had stopped wanting to go to Grandma Helen's house, and Sandra had gently encouraged her to be polite. The family court judge awarded temporary full custody to Derek and me, jointly, pending a review. Sandra was permitted supervised visitation. She began intensive trauma therapy the week after the trial ended. I will tell you something honest. I spent 6 months furious at Sandra, a cold, constant fury, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but sits in the back of every interaction, every phone call, every supervised visit, where I watched her hold my granddaughter's hand and cry. I could not separate what she had failed to do from who she was. I could not separate her from Helen. I kept thinking, how do you not know? How do you leave your child with a monster and not know? It took me a long time to understand that knowing and seeing are not the same thing. Sandra had been conditioned since childhood not to see. That is the most precise word I can use. Conditioned. The way you train a dog not to approach certain things by pairing them with pain. Helen had paired questions, awareness, and resistance with consequences for so long and so early that Sandra's mind had simply stopped generating those responses in certain directions. She was not stupid. She was not malicious. She was someone whose survival mechanism had become her blind spot. That does not make her blameless. I still believe she bears responsibility for what happened. I still believe my granddaughter paid for her blind spot in ways no child should ever pay. But I no longer hate her. Hatred is expensive. At 64, I cannot afford it. My granddaughter started working with a therapist named Dr. Patricia Wells 3 days after she was discharged from the hospital, where she had been monitored for 24 hours. Dr. Wells specialized in childhood trauma, and she was, from the very first session, exactly the right person. Calm, warm, funny in the dry, understated way that children respond to without being able to explain why. The first 3 months were hard. My granddaughter had nightmares 2 or 3 nights a week. She would not stay in any room with a closet door that was closed. She needed a night light, needed the bedroom door open, needed to be able to see the hallway at all times. She did not want to go to school because the coat room had a low ceiling and no windows and she could not be in it. Derek slept on a cot in her room for 11 weeks. I drove her to school every morning and walked her inside until she was comfortable enough to walk in with a classmate. We rearranged the house so that every door she might need to open was propped open. We did not make it a big deal. We just made it a fact. One night, around month 4, she crawled into Derek's cot with him and she said, "Dad, Grandma Helen said I was bad. Am I bad?" Derek called me afterward to tell me what he had said to her. "I am going to write it here because I think it deserves to be written down." He said, "You are not bad. You have never been bad. What happened to you was not a punishment. It was a crime. And the person who did it is in prison now because what she did was wrong. Not you. Her." She thought about that for a while. Then she said, "Is Grandma Helen going to die in prison?" And Derek, my son, 38 years old, exhausted, sleeping on a cot in his daughter's room for the 4th month in a row, said, "Yes, sweetheart, she is." And my granddaughter said, "Okay," and she went to sleep. She is 10 now, 4th grade. She is obsessed with horses, and she has been taking riding lessons for the past 6 months at a stable 20 minutes from the house. She is not the most natural rider, her instructor says, but she has what the instructor calls persistence, meaning she falls off and gets back on before anyone has the chance to offer sympathy. I drove her to the stables every Saturday morning for 3 months before Derek started taking over on the days I couldn't make it. I do not tell her she is brave. I do not point out how far she has come. I just drive and watch, and sometimes she waves at me from the ring and I wave back. The nightmares come less often. She still sleeps with the door open. Sandra and Derek are no longer married. The divorce was finalized 14 months after the arrest. It was not dramatic, and it was not simple, and it was not anyone's best moment, but it was necessary, and they both knew it. They share custody now, formalized through the court, and Sandra has made real and visible progress in therapy. She and my granddaughter have a relationship. It is careful and slowly built, and it is hers and my granddaughter's to define, not mine. I see Sandra at school events, at pickup, at the birthday party. My granddaughter insisted that both her parents attend. I am civil. I am not warm. Maybe someday I will be warmer. I do not know. I am 64 years old, and I have learned that forgiveness is not a single decision you make and then are done with. It is something you make again every time you see someone and choose how to treat them. I choose, for my granddaughter's sake, to treat Sandra with basic human decency. That is where I am. It may be where I stay. Marcus Marsh's remains were released after the trial. There was a small service at a funeral home in Garfield County. Sandra arranged it. A few people came, elderly neighbors who remembered the boy who ran away in 1998, who remembered Helen accepting their condolences and never quite crying. A woman who had been Marcus's 2nd-grade teacher said she remembered him as quiet and careful and very good at drawing horses. She had wondered about him for years. My granddaughter asked to go to the burial. Derek and I talked about it for a long time. She was 9 years old. She had been through enough. But she was also clear and specific about why she wanted to go, the way children sometimes are when they have processed something in therapy and arrived at a conclusion adults might take years longer to reach. "He was alone for a long time," she said. "In that box? I want him to know somebody came." We went on a Saturday morning in October. The cemetery was in Garfield County, an older section with oak trees and damp grass, the sky the particular gray of Midwestern autumn. There was no crowd. Just us, a minister, and the funeral home staff. My granddaughter brought a drawing she had made herself. A horse, green field, blue sky. She had written his name in the corner in purple marker. Marcus. She placed it against the stone and was quiet for a moment, the way she gets when she is thinking hard about something. "I don't know you," she said, "but I know what happened to you, and it wasn't fair. And I was in a box too, but my grandpa found me. I'm sorry nobody found you in time." She paused. She looked at the drawing for a moment. "I ride horses now. This is for you." She stood up and took my hand, and we walked back to the car together. Derek was waiting by the trunk with a thermos of hot chocolate. She accepted a cup without ceremony and drank it, and said she was hungry and could we stop for eggs somewhere. We stopped at a diner on Route 30. She ordered a short stack and ate the whole thing, and told us about a show she had watched about wild mustangs, and I listened to her voice and watched the color in her cheeks and thought, This is what surviving looks like. Not heroic, not dramatic, just a 10-year-old girl eating pancakes on a Saturday morning, alive and safe and hungry. I want to say something to you before I go, something I have been turning over for a long time. I did not know that Helen Marsh was doing what she was doing. I want to be honest about that. I had no specific suspicion, no gut feeling that something was wrong in that basement. I came to drop off a key. I heard a sound, that is all. But here is what I have thought about in the year and a half since. There were moments. Small ones, easy to dismiss. My granddaughter pulling back slightly when Helen put her arms around her, the way children pull back from people they are afraid of. A comment my granddaughter made once, something like, "Grandma Helen doesn't like when you spill things," said in a careful voice, a voice that was trying to warn me of something without having words for it. I had filed it under children exaggerate. I had moved on. I was wrong to move on. I am telling you this because if there is a child in your life who flinches at certain names, who becomes careful when certain people are mentioned, who says things in quiet voices about what happens when they are bad, please do not file it away. Please do not move on. Children do not have the language for everything that happens to them, but they have the instinct to tell you. They are always telling you. The question is whether we are listening. I found my granddaughter because I happened to drop off a key on a Wednesday, because the basement door happened to be unlocked, because I happened to be 64 years old and unhurried enough to stand still and listen to a sound I could not immediately explain. I am not a hero. I am a retired electrician who got lucky on a Wednesday afternoon. But I will tell you this, I would do it again. I would break every hasp, I would pry open every lock, I would take the crowbar or the screwdriver or my bare hands to anything that stood between me and that voice. That is what we owe children. Everything. She has a horse show in 3 weeks. She has been practicing her posting trot and she is getting better, and she has decided that the horse she likes best is a bay mare named Clementine, who tolerates her imperfect technique with what the instructor calls unusual patience. My granddaughter has decided this means Clementine understands her. I will be in the stands for the show with a cup of Bad Diner coffee and my phone fully charged to take photographs. She will probably not win. She does not care. She just wants me to be there. I'll be there. Thanks for listening. If this story reached you, share it with someone who works with kids, someone who might hear something quiet that they'd otherwise let pass. You might be the person who makes the difference. You really might.